Every 4 years, the United States witnesses one of its most important rituals, the swearing in of a new president. This event has become an iconic moment in American democracy. It is a ceremony that marks not just a transfer of power, but a symbolic reaffirmation of the peaceful transition of authority which has been a cornerstone of American governance since the nation's founding. In this documentary, we will explore the history of U.S. presidential inaugurations, focusing on the evolution of the ceremony, the profound words spoken during the inaugural addresses, and the meaning behind these moments of political transition. We will look at how each inaugural address reflected the nation's mood and the individual challenges that each president faced. We will also trace how the inauguration ceremony has evolved and look forward to what future inaugurations might hold. We would feature George Washington, Barack Obama, the death of bin Laden, Joe Biden, the emergence of Donald Trump, and so on. The first inaugurations, the birth of the Republic. The history of presidential inaugurations begins with George Washington, the first president of the United States. On April 30, 1789, in New York City's Federal Hall, Washington took the oath of office in a ceremony that set the standard for the peaceful transfer of power. Washington's inauguration was modest in comparison to today's grand events, but its significance could not be overstated. Washington's inaugural address in 1789 included a solemn pledge to defend the Constitution and preserve the nascent Union. Washington, who had led the country to victory in the Revolutionary War, set the precedent for presidential speech-making, with his references to divine providence and his deep commitment to the unity of the nation. Washington's address focused on national unity and the need for a strong, centralized government. His words set the tone for the presidency and showed the world the character and humility required to lead a fledgling nation. His call for the blessings of liberty and protection of the inviolable principles of the Constitution would resonate in the speeches of presidents for centuries to come. In 1793, Washington was inaugurated for a second term. His second inaugural address was notably shorter and more formal. In it, he expressed a sense of solemnity about the office, acknowledging the weight of the presidency and the struggles the new nation faced, including threats of foreign intervention. He made clear that his second term would be devoted to preserving peace and stability. Bookmark 1. YQ Key Events and Challenges During Washington's Presidency. Though Washington's presidency was characterized by the peaceful establishment of federal institutions, it was also marked by several pivotal events that tested his leadership. One of the first and most important challenges he faced was the creation of the nation's financial system. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, proposed a plan to centralize and pay off the nation's Revolutionary War debts, which were scattered among the states and creditors. Hamilton's plan also included the creation of a national bank, which would provide a stable currency and help stabilize the country's economy. While Washington supported Hamilton's proposals, they were met with fierce opposition, particularly from Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who feared that a powerful central government would undermine state sovereignty. The debates over Hamilton's financial plan were a crucial moment in Washington's presidency. On one hand, Hamilton's plan was essential for economic stability, but on the other hand, it raised concerns about the power of the federal government. Washington had to navigate these debates carefully, and in the end, his support for Hamilton's plan helped solidify the federal government's authority over economic matters. Washington's decision to back Hamilton's financial policies marked the beginning of the political divisions between the emerging Federalist and Democratic-Republican parties. While Hamilton's policies were instrumental in building the nation's financial infrastructure, they also laid the groundwork for partisan politics. This division would shape the political landscape for decades to come, with Jefferson and Madison championing a vision of limited government, while Hamilton and his followers believed in a strong federal state. Another defining event of Washington's presidency was the implementation of the Jay Treaty in 1794. The treaty was an agreement between the United States and Great Britain, which sought to resolve lingering issues from the Revolutionary War and prevent further conflict between the two nations. While the treaty was successful in averting war and establishing trade relations, it was highly unpopular with the American public, especially among the Jeffersonian Republicans, who saw it as an endorsement of British influence in America. The Jay Treaty was highly contentious. Washington understood that, in the interest of the country's survival, he had to make pragmatic decisions. But the treaty symbolized the emerging divisions in American politics. It highlighted the tension between those who favored stronger ties with Britain and those who believed the future of the United States lay with France and its revolutionary ideals, foreign policy, and the Neutrality Proclamation. One of Washington's most important and enduring decisions came in 1793, when he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, which declared that the United States would remain neutral in the ongoing war between Britain and France. This decision was significant because it established the United States' foreign policy direction for years to come, one of non-intervention and a reluctance to become entangled in European conflicts. The Neutrality Proclamation was a defining moment for Washington. The United States was still a young nation, and Washington recognized that getting involved in European wars could jeopardize the country's survival. By keeping the nation out of foreign conflicts, Washington set a precedent of avoiding alliances that could drag the country into wars that were not in its best interest. The Neutrality Proclamation had lasting implications for American foreign policy, and it would be referenced by many future presidents. It also angered France, which had supported the United States during the Revolutionary War, and it deepened political divisions at home. Yet, Washington remained resolute in his belief that the United States needed to focus on strengthening itself internally before engaging in European affairs. In 1894, Washington faced another significant test when farmers in western Pennsylvania rebelled against an excise tax on whiskey. This was known as the Whiskey Rebellion, and it was one of the first major challenges to the authority of the new federal government. The farmers saw the tax as unfair and burdensome, and they took up arms against federal officials. The Whiskey Rebellion was important because it tested the federal government's ability to enforce its laws. Washington saw the rebellion as a threat to the stability of the nation, and, despite calls for leniency, he personally led a militia force to suppress the rebellion. His decision to use force sent a clear message that the federal government had the power to enforce laws, but it also showed Washington's commitment to the rule of law. When George Washington retired in 1797, he left behind a fledgling republic that was far stronger and more unified than when he took office. His leadership laid the foundation for the presidency, the federal government, and the nation as a whole. Through his actions, his neutrality in foreign policy, his support for Hamilton's financial system, and his willingness to relinquish power after 2 terms, Washington helped define the principles that would guide the country for generations to come. Washington's greatest legacy was not just his leadership, but the sense of duty and service he instilled in the presidency. He set the standard for future presidents in terms of both conduct and vision. His refusal to seek more power, his commitment to a government of laws, and his willingness to be a servant of the people remain some of the most important elements of his legacy. George Washington's presidency is often regarded as the most foundational period in American history. His decisions, actions, and example established principles that have endured for centuries. His inauguration, simple yet profound, marked the start of a new chapter in American democracy. It is fitting that Washington, as the first president, not only shaped the office itself but also shaped the very identity of the nation he helped to create. The early republic, from Adams to Jefferson. The tradition of presidential inaugurations continued with John Adams, the second president of the United States. Adams took the oath of office on March 4, 1797, in Philadelphia. His inaugural address focused on his desire to continue Washington's policies of neutrality in foreign affairs and to strengthen the national government. John Adams's speech was dignified but received some criticism. He promised to work for unity and progress despite political opposition. However, his presidency marked the first time a sitting president handed over power to a political rival, as Adams lost the 1800 election to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's first inauguration on March 4, 1801, marked a significant shift in American politics. Jefferson, the leader of the Democratic-Republican Party, was a proponent of a more limited federal government. His inaugural address was historic in its message of reconciliation and unity, despite the fierce political rivalry between him and the Federalists. Jefferson's first inaugural address is one of the most significant in American history. His famous words, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," embodied his desire to heal the divisions between the two parties and emphasize the unity of the American people. It was a powerful statement that showed a commitment to the Constitution, despite political differences. Jefferson also emphasized the principles of individual liberty and the importance of the democratic system, laying the foundation for future presidential speeches that would seek to unite the country, even in times of political discord. The 19th century, expanding the nation and the presidency. The 19th century saw the inauguration of presidents who would define the direction of the country. Andrew Jackson's inauguration in 1829 was one of the most notable of the era. Jackson, the first president elected from the western frontier, symbolized the rise of the common man in American politics. Jackson's inauguration was held at the newly completed White House and was attended by a massive crowd. Jackson invited ordinary citizens to the event, and chaos ensued as throngs of people flooded the White House. This marked the beginning of the tradition of making the inauguration a public event for the people. Jackson's inaugural address was relatively short and focused on his vision of democracy. He pledged to work toward greater equality and to oppose any form of elitism in government. His populist rhetoric was aimed at dismantling the entrenched power of the political elite and shifting more authority to the people. Jackson's inauguration reflected the dramatic shifts taking place in American society. His speech emphasized the value of the common people and the importance of government accountability. This was a moment that symbolized the rise of populism in American politics, a force that would continue to shape the presidency for generations. The presidential inaugurations of the 19th century continued to grow in size and spectacle. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln's first inauguration took place against the backdrop of a nation on the brink of civil war. Lincoln's speech, delivered in front of a deeply divided nation, was one of the most significant in American history. Lincoln's inaugural address was filled with appeals for unity, despite the secession of several Southern states. He famously said, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies." His call for reconciliation, along with his steadfast commitment to preserving the Union, made his speech one of the most poignant in presidential history. Lincoln's first inaugural address was an emotional plea for national unity. At a time when the country was on the edge of disintegration, his words became a guiding light. Lincoln's call for peace, understanding, and the importance of preserving the Union was a moment of great moral clarity in a time of profound national crisis. Lincoln would be inaugurated for a second term in 1865, just a month before his assassination. His second inaugural address is widely regarded as one of the most eloquent speeches in American history. Delivered at the conclusion of the Civil War, Lincoln's words called for malice toward none and charity for all, providing a framework for national healing and reconciliation. The 20th century modernization and global leadership. As the 20th century dawned, inaugurations became more public spectacles, aided by the rise of radio and television. Franklin D. Roosevelt's first inauguration in 1933 occurred during the depths of the Great Depression. His address, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," became one of the most famous lines in American political history. FDR's inaugural speech focused on optimism and the resolve to overcome economic hardship. His call for immediate action to combat the Depression set the stage for his New Deal policies. The address reassured Americans and emphasized government intervention as the key to solving the nation's most pressing problems. FDR's first inaugural address was a defining moment in the history of American presidencies. It was not just a speech, it was a message of hope to millions of people struggling during the Great Depression. Roosevelt's use of radio to directly address the American people transformed the relationship between the president and the public. The televised inauguration of John F. Kennedy in 1961 marked a new era in how inaugurations were experienced. His youthful energy and eloquent rhetoric struck a chord with a nation hungry for change. Kennedy's inaugural address was filled with calls to action, including his famous challenge, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." JFK's inaugural address was a rallying cry for the new generation. His speech called on Americans to embrace public service and take responsibility for the nation's future. His words resonated deeply with a country facing the challenges of the Cold War, civil rights struggles, and an evolving global landscape. In the years that followed, inaugurations became increasingly extravagant, with pageantry, musical performances, and the involvement of various celebrity figures. Ronald Reagan's 1981 inauguration was marked by optimism and grandeur, as the country looked forward to a new era of prosperity and strength. The 21st century, the digital age, and shifting politics. In the 21st century, the tradition of the presidential inauguration has remained a central part of American culture, but the format has adapted to changing times. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 marked a historic moment in American history. The first African-American president was about to take office. Obama's first inauguration in 2009 was a moment of profound national pride. The ceremony was attended by over 1 million people in Washington, D.C. Obama's address was a call for unity and change. His message emphasized hope, the need to rebuild the economy, and the promise of a new direction after the global financial crisis. Obama's inauguration was not just about one man becoming president. It was a symbol of progress and transformation for the nation. His speech was filled with messages of optimism and change, and the presence of millions who gathered for the event reflected the significance of this moment in American history. Key events and challenges during Barack Obama's presidency. Barack Obama, the 44th President of the United States, served 2 terms from 2009 to 2017, ushering in a new era of American politics. His presidency was defined by significant challenges, transformative policies, and landmark moments both at home and abroad. Obama's presidency was marked by efforts to combat the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis. Major legislative achievements like the Affordable Care Act and complex foreign policy decisions in a rapidly changing global landscape. Let's take a closer look at the key events and challenges that defined Obama's tenure. The 2008 financial crisis and the Great Recession narrator. When Barack Obama took office on January 20, 2009, the United States was grappling with the aftermath of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. The global economy was in free fall. Banks were failing, and millions of Americans were losing their jobs and homes. The stock market had crashed, and the housing bubble had burst, pushing the nation into a deep recession. Obama's first challenge as president was to stabilize the economy and restore faith in the financial system. The 2008 financial crisis left the U.S. economy in shambles. The unemployment rate had skyrocketed, home values plummeted, and the global financial system was on the brink of collapse. When Obama entered office, the American people were desperate for change, and the economy was his most immediate and pressing concern. Obama inherited a staggering $1.3 trillion budget deficit and a job market in crisis. He quickly moved to pass a massive stimulus package, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, aimed at jump-starting the economy. The $787 billion package included tax cuts, federal spending on infrastructure, and funding for social programs to alleviate the worst effects of the recession. The stimulus bill was a bold move, but it was also controversial. Some criticized it as too expensive, while others felt it didn't do enough to directly address the needs of working-class Americans. However, Obama's administration firmly believed that government intervention was necessary to avoid a prolonged economic depression. While the stimulus package helped stabilize the economy and led to a slow recovery, the effects were not immediately felt across the nation. The unemployment rate remained high for years, and many Americans were skeptical about the pace of recovery. Nonetheless, the Obama administration took further steps to strengthen the economy, including the controversial auto industry bailout, which helped save General Motors and Chrysler from collapse, the Affordable Care Act, ACA, Obamacare. Perhaps the most iconic and transformative piece of legislation passed during Obama's presidency was the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare. Aimed at expanding healthcare coverage to millions of uninsured Americans, the ACA was the culmination of years of efforts to reform the healthcare system in the U.S. Healthcare reform was always one of Obama's primary goals, and the ACA was the boldest attempt to overhaul the system in decades. The law sought to make healthcare more affordable by providing subsidies, expanding Medicaid, and prohibiting insurance companies from denying coverage based on pre-existing conditions. The road to passing the ACA was long and contentious. Obama faced fierce opposition from Republicans and many conservative groups who saw the ACA as an overreach of government power. The bill passed Congress along party lines, with Democrats supporting it and Republicans vehemently opposing it. Despite this, Obama remained steadfast in his commitment to reform. Obama's push for the ACA was one of the defining moments of his presidency. It was a monumental effort to extend healthcare coverage to millions of uninsured Americans and a major step toward achieving universal health coverage. However, the law also sparked intense political divisions, and it would remain a target for Republican attacks throughout Obama's presidency. The ACA's passage was a significant achievement, but its implementation was fraught with difficulties. The website for enrollment, healthcare.gov, was plagued with technical issues at launch, and the law's individual mandate, which required Americans to purchase health insurance or face a penalty, was deeply unpopular. Despite these challenges, the ACA ultimately succeeded in reducing the number of uninsured Americans and reshaping the U.S. healthcare system. The ACA was a landmark achievement for Obama, but it also faced intense opposition. The GOP relentlessly campaigned to repeal and replace it, culminating in efforts to dismantle it during the Trump administration. The ACA's legacy is still a topic of debate, but Obama's commitment to health reform was one of the most enduring aspects of his presidency. Foreign policy. The Iraq War and the War on Terror. Upon taking office, Obama inherited two ongoing military conflicts from his predecessor, George W. Bush, the Iraq War and the War on Terror in Afghanistan. Obama's approach to foreign policy was shaped by a desire to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, refocus American efforts on counterterrorism, and restore America's standing in the world after the controversial years of the Bush administration. Obama came into office with a clear mandate to wind down the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. His foreign policy was built around the idea of resetting America's international relationships, emphasizing diplomacy and shifting away from the unilateralism that characterized the Bush years. One of Obama's first major actions as president was to announce a plan to withdraw U.S. combat troops from Iraq. He fulfilled this campaign promise by ordering the removal of U.S. forces, completing the drawdown by the end of 2011. While the withdrawal was largely seen as a fulfillment of Obama's commitment to ending the Iraq War, it also left behind a fragile political situation in Iraq that would later contribute to the rise of the Islamic State, ISIS. The Iraq withdrawal was controversial because, although it ended the U.S. military involvement in the conflict, it created a vacuum that allowed insurgent groups like ISIS to gain power in the region. The situation in Iraq remained unstable, and this became a significant challenge for Obama in the following years. In Afghanistan, Obama initially increased troop levels to combat the Taliban insurgency, but he also set a timeline for withdrawal, hoping to transition control to the Afghan government. However, the situation in Afghanistan remained difficult, with the Taliban continuing to carry out attacks and the Afghan government struggling to maintain stability. One of the most defining moments of Obama's presidency came in May 2011, when U.S. Navy SEALs located and killed al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. Bin Laden, the mastermind behind the September 11, 2001 attacks, had evaded capture for nearly a decade. The death of Osama bin Laden was a monumental event for both Obama and the United States. It was a moment of closure for a nation that had been grieving the 9/11 attacks for nearly 10 years. Obama's decision to order the raid was a risky one, but it ultimately solidified his reputation as a decisive leader. The operation was carried out with precision, and bin Laden's death was seen as a major victory in the war on terror. Obama's approval ratings surged in the wake of the operation, and it became one of the most iconic moments of his presidency. Paris Agreement on climate change. Another key achievement during Obama's second term was his leadership in the fight against climate change. In 2015, Obama played a pivotal role in brokering the Paris Agreement, an international accord aimed at limiting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Obama's role in the Paris Agreement was one of the highlights of his second term. Climate change was a major focus for him, and the agreement represented a global effort to combat the environmental crisis. Although the deal was not legally binding, it set ambitious goals for reducing carbon emissions and placed pressure on countries around the world to take action. The Paris Agreement was a significant achievement in Obama's foreign policy as it demonstrated American leadership on the global stage and reflected his commitment to addressing climate change. However, the agreement was met with opposition from some Republicans who argued that it would harm the U.S. economy. The agreement would later be a focal point during the Trump administration, which withdrew the U.S. from the accord. Racial tensions and the fight for racial justice. Obama's presidency was also marked by significant racial tensions in the United States. The first African-American president faced a deeply divided nation, with issues of race and police brutality coming to the forefront during his time in office. The deaths of African Americans such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Eric Garner led to widespread protests, particularly with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. Obama's presidency coincided with a period of intense racial reckoning in America. While he symbolized progress as the first black president, his presidency also exposed deep-rooted racial inequalities. Obama often spoke out about the need for justice and reconciliation, but his administration's ability to address these issues was limited. Obama responded to these events by calling for national dialogue on race and pushing for reforms in the criminal justice system. He also advocated for greater police accountability and improved community police relations. While his presidency saw significant progress on issues of racial equality, the challenges remained deeply entrenched. As Obama's second term drew to a close, the nation faced a highly contentious presidential election in 2016. The race between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump was marked by deep divisions in the country, with issues of immigration, trade, and identity at the forefront. Obama's last year in office was defined by the rise of populist sentiment. The 2016 election was unprecedented in many ways, with Trump's anti-establishment rhetoric and promises to overturn Obama's policies energizing a large portion of the electorate. Obama campaigned hard for Clinton, but the election results were a stark reminder of the political polarization that had grown during his presidency. After Trump's surprise victory, Obama worked to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. His legacy was left in the hands of his successor, but many of the policies he championed, especially the Affordable Care Act and climate change agreements, were hotly contested in the years to come. Barack Obama's presidency was marked by bold policy initiatives, facing national challenges, and a continually shifting political landscape. His legacy, while complex and contentious, continues to shape the direction of the United States and its place in the world. Donald Trump's inauguration in 2017 came at a time of deep division in the country. His election sparked widespread protests, and his swearing-in ceremony reflected the polarized political environment. Despite the protests, the inauguration followed the traditional script, with speeches, military honors, and a parade. Trump's inauguration was a reflection of the contentious nature of American politics in the 21st century. While the ceremony itself remained largely ceremonial, the divisions in the country were on full display, with protests and demonstrations marking the transition. Donald Trump's rise to the presidency was unprecedented. A businessman and television personality with no prior political experience, Trump announced his candidacy for president in June 2015. His campaign was marked by populist rhetoric, promises to make America great again, and controversial remarks about immigration, trade, and foreign relations. Trump's political outsider status and direct communication with voters through social media attracted a large and loyal following. Trump's candidacy in 2015 was initially seen as a novelty. Many political analysts thought his campaign would falter as his brash rhetoric and controversial statements alienated establishment figures. But he tapped into the frustrations of working-class Americans, particularly those in rural areas who felt left behind by globalization and political elites. In the 2016 election, Trump's Republican campaign faced off against former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee. The election was one of the most contentious in American history, with issues of immigration, trade, economic inequality, and race dominating the debate. Despite losing the popular vote by nearly 3 million votes, Trump secured a narrow victory in the Electoral College, winning the presidency in a stunning upset. Trump's win shocked the political establishment and highlighted the growing divisions within the United States. His victory was a repudiation of the political status quo, and it laid the foundation for many of the policy shifts and cultural battles that defined his time in office. Bookmark E. The first 100 days, executive orders and policy changes. In the first months of Trump's presidency, he moved quickly to implement his policy agenda through executive orders, bypassing Congress where possible. His administration's priorities were clear: build a border wall with Mexico, renegotiate trade deals, reduce federal regulations, and repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare. Trump's first 100 days were a whirlwind. He took immediate action to fulfill many of his campaign promises, especially regarding immigration and the economy. The executive orders on border security, deregulation, and trade were part of his vision to reshape America's relationship with the world and with its own domestic systems. One of the most controversial moves in his early presidency was the executive order to ban travel from several predominantly Muslim countries, known as the Muslim ban. The policy, which aimed to improve national security, was met with legal challenges and protests across the country. Courts blocked parts of the order, but Trump's administration eventually revised and reissued it in a form that withstood legal scrutiny. The Muslim ban was one of the defining moments of Trump's presidency. It sparked nationwide protests and legal battles, but it also solidified his base of supporters who saw it as a necessary measure to protect the country from terrorism. However, it also heightened concerns about religious discrimination and the erosion of civil liberties. Bookmark 5. The repeal of Obamacare. One of Trump's most ambitious policy goals was the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, ACA, the landmark healthcare reform law passed under President Obama in 2010. The ACA had expanded healthcare access to millions of Americans, but Trump and many Republicans in Congress viewed it as a costly and overreaching government program. Repealing Obamacare was a top priority for Trump, and it was central to his political identity. Throughout the campaign, he promised to dismantle the law and replace it with something better. The GOP, led by Trump, tried multiple times to repeal and replace the ACA, but it became clear that the Republican Party was divided on how to approach healthcare reform. Despite multiple attempts by Republican lawmakers, including the high-profile effort to repeal the ACA in 2017, Trump's promise to fully repeal the law ultimately fell short. The Senate narrowly voted against the repeal, and the failure was a major setback for Trump's domestic agenda. However, the administration did manage to eliminate the individual mandate, the provision that required Americans to have health insurance or pay a penalty, through the 2017 tax reform bill. The Russia investigation and the Mueller report. One of the most significant challenges to Trump's presidency was the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. The investigation, led by special counsel Robert Mueller, sought to determine whether Trump's campaign colluded with Russia and whether Trump himself obstructed justice in relation to the probe. The Russia investigation dominated the early years of Trump's presidency. Allegations of Russian interference in the election and potential collusion between Trump's campaign and Russian officials raised questions about the legitimacy of his victory. While the investigation produced charges against several Trump associates, including former campaign chairman Paul Manafort and National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, it ultimately did not find conclusive evidence of collusion. The Mueller report, released in 2019, concluded that while there were numerous contacts between members of the Trump campaign and Russian operatives, there was insufficient evidence to charge anyone with conspiring to influence the election. However, the report did not exonerate Trump on obstruction of justice, leaving that question to Congress. The investigation created a cloud of controversy that would follow Trump throughout his presidency, leading to two separate impeachment proceedings. Bookmark. The impeachment of Donald Trump. Donald Trump became the third president in U.S. history to be impeached by the House of Representatives. The first impeachment, in late 2019, stemmed from a phone call Trump had with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Trump was accused of pressuring Ukraine to investigate his political rival, Joe Biden, and withholding military aid as leverage. The 2019 impeachment was deeply partisan. Democrats argued that Trump's actions violated his oath of office and endangered national security by attempting to interfere in a foreign election. Trump and his Republican allies maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that the impeachment was politically motivated. The House of Representatives passed two articles of impeachment, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, but the Senate, controlled by Republicans, acquitted Trump in early 2020. Despite the acquittal, the impeachment process further polarized the nation and added to the political turmoil surrounding Trump's presidency. Trump faced a second impeachment in early 2021 after the January 6th Capitol riot, which followed a speech he gave encouraging his supporters to stop the steal and protest the certification of the 2020 election results. The House of Representatives charged Trump with incitement of insurrection, making him the first president in U.S. history to be impeached twice. The Senate trial occurred after Trump left office and he was acquitted again, though the impeachment proceedings reflected the growing divisions within American politics. The COVID-19 pandemic. One of the most profound challenges of Trump's presidency was the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. The virus, which began spreading in late 2019, quickly became a global health crisis. In the U.S., the pandemic would have far-reaching consequences for public health, the economy, and politics. The COVID-19 pandemic was a crisis like no other in modern American history. The U.S. faced an unprecedented public health emergency, and the Trump administration's handling of the crisis was heavily criticized. Trump downplayed the severity of the virus in its early stages and clashed with public health experts, leading to confusion and mixed messages about how to respond. Trump's response to the pandemic included the implementation of travel restrictions, a focus on vaccine development through Operation Warp Speed, and repeated downplaying of the virus's threat. However, his handling of the crisis faced heavy criticism as cases surged and deaths mounted. The delay in implementing widespread testing, mixed messaging on masks, and disputes with state governors over reopening strategies fueled a public backlash. Trump's leadership during the pandemic was one of the most contentious aspects of his presidency. His rhetoric and actions were polarizing, with supporters applauding his efforts to reopen the economy and critics accusing him of mishandling the crisis. The pandemic undoubtedly played a central role in his loss in the 2020 election. The 2020 election and Trump's refusal to concede. In November 2020, Donald Trump faced off against former Vice President Joe Biden in a fiercely contested election. The COVID-19 pandemic had shifted the election dynamics, with a record number of Americans voting by mail and early voting due to health concerns. The election saw the highest voter turnout in over a century. After a contentious and at times chaotic campaign, Biden won the election with 306 electoral votes to Trump's 232. Trump and his allies refused to accept the results, claiming widespread voter fraud without providing concrete evidence. Trump's legal team launched dozens of unsuccessful lawsuits attempting to overturn the election results. Trump's refusal to concede the 2020 election was unprecedented in American history. His claims of voter fraud and attempts to pressure state officials to overturn the results created a constitutional crisis. This culminated in the January 6th Capitol riot, where Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol in an effort to stop the certification of the election result. The Capitol riot and the end of Trump's presidency. On January 6, 2021, a mob of Trump supporters, encouraged by his rhetoric, stormed the U.S. Capitol in an attempt to disrupt the certification of Joe Biden's election victory. The attack resulted in deaths, injuries, and widespread damage to the Capitol building. The Capitol riot was a shocking and violent culmination of years of political polarization and Trump's rhetoric. The images of the mob breaching the Capitol and the ensuing chaos were a stark reminder of how deeply divided the country had become under Trump's leadership. Trump's involvement in inciting the riot led to his second impeachment, and his presidency came to a close just 2 weeks later. He left office in January 2021, having made a lasting impact on American politics, particularly in terms of political polarization, populist rhetoric, and the growing divide between the political left and right. Donald Trump's presidency was marked by bold actions, immense controversy, and deepening divisions within the nation. From his unpredictable leadership style to his handling of the pandemic and his refusal to accept the 2020 election results, Trump's time in office left a lasting imprint on the American political landscape. Joe Biden's inauguration in 2021 came at a moment of national crisis. The country was grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic, political unrest, and the aftermath of a divisive election. Biden's speech emphasized healing, unity, and the need to restore democratic norms. The event was scaled back due to the pandemic, but it was nonetheless a moment of hope for many Americans. Joe Biden, the 46th President of the United States, assumed office on January 20, 2021, amidst unprecedented challenges. His presidency began during a global health crisis, COVID-19, while the nation was also grappling with deep political divisions, economic instability, and complex foreign policy issues. Biden promised to restore normalcy to American politics, heal the nation, and address urgent issues like climate change, economic recovery, and racial justice. His first years in office have been marked by significant achievements and challenges, some of which continue to shape the trajectory of his presidency. The COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine rollout. Joe Biden inherited a nation deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic when he took office in January 2021. At that time, the U.S. was experiencing its highest number of COVID-19 cases and deaths, with vaccines just beginning to roll out. Biden made controlling the pandemic and speeding up the vaccine distribution one of his administration's top priorities. The pandemic was the first and foremost challenge for Joe Biden. He campaigned on the promise that he would manage the virus more effectively, especially given the uncertainty and mishandling of the pandemic under the Trump administration. Biden's approach was focused on science and public health. In his first 100 days, Biden focused on increasing the distribution of COVID-19 vaccines. His administration set a goal to administer 100 million doses within the first 100 days. The rollout faced challenges, including logistical hurdles and disparities in access, but significant progress was made. By the middle of 2021, millions of Americans had been vaccinated, and cases began to decline, especially among those vaccinated. Biden's success with the vaccine rollout helped restore some confidence in the federal government's ability to respond to public health crises. However, challenges remained, particularly with vaccine hesitancy in certain segments of the population and the rise of new variants like Delta and Omicron. Despite the success of the vaccine campaign, the pandemic remained a significant political and public health challenge throughout Biden's early years. The administration continued to face criticism for uneven vaccine distribution and for navigating the balance between reopening the economy and maintaining public health safeguards. One of Biden's first major legislative victories came with the passage of the American Rescue Plan, ARP, in March 2021. This $1.9 trillion stimulus package was designed to provide economic relief in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, providing direct payments to Americans, extending unemployment benefits, and funding vaccine distribution. The American Rescue Plan was a bold move to address the economic devastation caused by the pandemic. It was aimed at providing immediate relief to millions of Americans who had lost jobs, income, or health care during the crisis. The bill also sought to reduce child poverty through expanded child tax credits. The package received widespread support from Democrats, but was highly controversial among Republicans. Despite opposition, the ARP was passed with no Republican votes in Congress, underscoring the partisan divide that has continued to characterize much of Biden's presidency. The ARP was one of Biden's signature achievements in his first year, and it helped provide immediate economic relief. However, the inflationary pressures that followed, partly due to the pandemic and government spending, became a significant concern for the administration moving forward. In August 2021, Biden faced one of his most controversial decisions, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. After nearly 2 decades of military involvement, the Biden administration followed through on an agreement made under the Trump administration to end the U.S. military presence in the country. The decision to withdraw from Afghanistan was part of Biden's long-standing belief that the U.S. should end its forever wars and focus on other priorities, including domestic issues and challenges in other regions. However, the execution of the withdrawal was chaotic and led to scenes of desperation at the Kabul airport. The withdrawal, marked by the rapid collapse of the Afghan government and the Taliban's swift return to power, was a significant blow to Biden's foreign policy reputation. The evacuation of thousands of American citizens, allies, and Afghan refugees became a logistical nightmare, and many criticized the administration's handling of the process. The images of Afghans clinging to U.S. steppe military planes as they took off from Kabul became an iconic and tragic symbol of the disorder. The withdrawal was a significant challenge for Biden. While ending the war in Afghanistan had widespread support among Americans, the manner in which it was carried out raised serious questions about the competence and planning of the administration. The chaotic exit overshadowed what was initially a policy win. In November 2021, Biden secured another major legislative victory with the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, a $1.2 trillion bill aimed at rebuilding the nation's infrastructure. The bill addressed long-standing issues such as aging roads, bridges, and transit systems, and included funding for broadband, clean energy, and electric vehicle charging stations. Biden's infrastructure bill was one of the few pieces of bipartisan legislation passed during his presidency. It showed that both parties could work together on issues of national importance, especially in a time when political polarization is at an all-time high. The passage of the bill represented a significant victory for Biden, as it fulfilled a core promise of his campaign, improving the nation's infrastructure while creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. However, it also faced opposition from some progressive Democrats who argued that it didn't go far enough to address climate change and social issues. As the U.S. economy began to recover from the pandemic in 2021, Biden faced new challenges related to inflation and supply chain disruptions. Prices for everyday goods, including food, gas, and housing, rose sharply, leading to a significant cost of living increase for many Americans. Inflation became one of the most pressing issues of 2021 and into 2022. Biden's presidency was hit hard by inflation, which reached its highest levels in decades. While some of the inflation was driven by pandemic-related disruptions, it became a politically charged issue. The administration struggled to address concerns over rising prices, and this contributed to declining approval ratings for Biden. The Federal Reserve took action to combat inflation by raising interest rates, but inflation remained a significant challenge for the administration. Biden's approval ratings were negatively impacted, and Republicans seized on the issue, blaming the administration's economic policies for rising costs. Biden's domestic agenda also included the Build Back Better plan, a sweeping $3.5 trillion package that aimed to expand social safety nets, address climate change, and invest in healthcare and education. However, the plan faced significant hurdles in Congress, particularly from moderate Democrats like Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who expressed concerns about the size and cost of the bill. The Build Back Better plan represented Biden's vision for a more progressive America, with investments in childcare, healthcare, and climate action. But it ran into significant opposition, not only from Republicans, but from moderate Democrats who were concerned about the fiscal impact. The negotiations and compromises ultimately weakened the bill. After months of negotiations, the Build Back Better plan was scaled down significantly. Parts of the bill were restructured and passed separately, but the full package never materialized. This was a major disappointment for Biden and his party, as it highlighted the difficulty of passing large-scale legislation in an era of deep political division. Biden's presidency also coincided with continued calls for racial justice and police reform in the wake of the George Floyd protests of 2020. Biden pledged to address systemic racism and promote greater equity, and his administration took several steps to address these issues. Biden's commitment to racial justice was clear from the beginning. His administration pushed for legislation such as the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, which sought to address police brutality, and worked to make systemic changes to ensure greater equity in areas like housing, healthcare, and voting rights. Despite efforts, police reform legislation stalled in Congress, with Republicans and some moderate Democrats opposing key provisions. The continued incidents of police violence and racial injustice, coupled with the polarization of the issue, made it difficult for the Biden administration to make significant progress in this area. In the 2022 midterm elections, the Democratic Party faced significant challenges, with historical trends favoring Republicans in midterm elections. However, despite predictions of a red wave, the results were more mixed than anticipated, with the Democrats holding on to the Senate but losing control of the House of Representatives. Biden's approval ratings were low heading into the midterms, and many expected Republicans to take control of Congress. However, the outcome was more favorable for Democrats than expected, which many attribute to the success of Biden's legislative initiatives and the rise of issues like abortion rights, which galvanized Democratic voters. The results of the 2022 midterms set the stage for a divided Congress, with Republicans controlling the House and Democrats holding the Senate. This political landscape would influence Biden's ability to pass legislation in the second half of his term. Foreign policy in the Ukraine crisis. Biden's foreign policy faced several tests, including growing tensions with China, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. The Ukraine invasion, in particular, became a defining moment for Biden's foreign policy legacy. The Russian invasion of Ukraine presented a huge challenge for Biden and the U.S. He was faced with the task of leading a coalition of Western nations in imposing sanctions on Russia, providing military aid to Ukraine, and managing the potential for a broader conflict. Biden's leadership in rallying NATO and supporting Ukraine was widely praised. Biden's swift response to Russia's invasion, including leading international sanctions and sending military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, solidified his standing in the global community. However, the war also placed significant strain on the global economy, contributing to rising energy prices and inflation. Conclusion. Joe Biden's presidency has been defined by its response to a multitude of crises, from the pandemic and economic instability to racial justice and a shifting geopolitical landscape. While his administration has had significant legislative achievements and foreign policy successes, it has also faced persistent challenges, from inflation to political polarization and stalled domestic legislation. Biden's ability to navigate these complex issues will continue to shape his presidency and the future direction of the United States. The future of inaugurations. As we look to the future, the tradition of presidential inaugurations will continue to evolve. In an age of technology, we may see inaugurations become even more accessible, with live streams, virtual reality, and social media allowing people from around the world to participate in the event in new ways. The future of inaugurations will be shaped by technological advancements. Virtual reality could allow people to attend the ceremony from anywhere in the world, and social media will continue to shape the way the public interacts with the event. the inauguration will likely become an even more global and interactive experience. From the quiet humility of George Washington's first inaugural address to the digital age of virtual participation, presidential inaugurations have evolved into moments of profound national reflection. Each ceremony marks the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the United States, one that reflects the spirit of the times, the values of the nation, and the ideals of democracy. As we move into the future, the presidential inauguration will continue to be a defining moment in American history, a celebration of the peaceful transfer of power, a reaffirmation of democracy, and a testament to the enduring strength of the United States. Thank you for joining us as we explored the history of U.S. presidential inaugurations, past, present, and future.